Hey everybody, welcome to your lecture on race. So when we're talking about race, one of the things I wanted you to do before I go through lecture is to click on the link underneath this lecture or in this week's module that says the Rachel Dolezal video. So click on it, watch the piece on her, and then when you're done, come back to me. Here is your good way to pause me. Hang on. I have to come up with some better places for you to pause me. I'll work on it. Okay, so you've watched Rachel Dolezal's video, so you have a sense of who she is. So one of the reasons why she made such a stir is because, this is her as a younger person. This is who she is now. And the change she made really kind of blew people's minds. If you want more information on her, if you want to read more about her, she's got a Netflix special that wasn't very popular, so I don't know if it's still streaming or not. People really pushed back up against this idea that somebody could change their race. And one of the things I'd like you to do at some point, you don't have to do it now, but at some point, either before or after lecture is done, start jotting down all of the things that she didn't experience as an African American or Black woman. So she changed her race, but what didn't she get to experience that also is a part of being Black or African American? That's not just about the way you look, but the experiences you have. So she got a lot of pushback. I think this is a great example of race because, and also, I don't remember in the video you watched if she used the phrase transracial or not, trying to kind of appropriate transgender, which we've talked about cultural appropriation. You can kind of match the two together. But I want you to know that transracial is not like a word that science or sociologists have embraced. It's her own words. So we talked about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Remember I said I can't say those words? That's what she did, was she came up with her own language. Okay, so I do think she is a really good example of race, which is, we define as sociologists, we say race is what is called a social construction. So what is a social construction? Basically, social construction means that a society, a culture, a group of people have determined what your racial identity is. So social constructions are things that are constructed by society. It's exactly what the phrase is. It's when society determines something and kind of runs with it and says, you look like X, Y, and Z, we're going to put you in this box. So for race, as a society, we have taken on people based on what we call their real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. And real or perceived is the kind of the key part here, because the way I look at somebody racially, somebody's race or racial makeup may be different than the way you do, because my sort of conditioning or socialization, like how I linked back to socialization. My socialization is that people of X, Y, and Z race look like this or act like this or have these features, right? Yours may be completely different than that based off of the way you were socialized. But a social construction is real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Doesn't mean that what everybody thinks is correct. That's the perceived part. But as a society, as a culture, we have all sort of agreed that if your skin is a certain color, then you fall under a different racial category, right? So like, I'm white. I really hope that's not a surprise for any of you. Those of you who have been just listening to me and not looking at me, I'm like white as white can be. I'm so white, a ghost would look at me and be like, I'm tan compared to you, right? So I'm extremely white. We all would look at me and say, oh, that's a white person, because we've socially constructed ourselves based on race. We've come up with categories for people. If an alien fell onto the earth from another planet and looked at me, they would be like, oh, you're totally purple or something, okay? Because that's their social construction of race. So I can give you thousands of examples of the social construction of race. I want you to take a second in a minute and watch one. I picked the example of apartheid just because apartheid was known for completely stereotyping and creating social constructions of race where maybe there wasn't there one before, but it was specifically to place people into different boxes and then give people different privileges or not give them privileges based off of whatever category they fell into. So the categories were white, black, and then what they called colored, or which was people of mixed race. And if you were in one of those categories, your life was completely different just based off of how you were constructed. So one of the ways they would figure this out, I have two images for you here. This is from apartheid. This is one of the kind of do not enter signs. One of the really super scientific ways that they would figure out if somebody was white or black, if you kind of fell into that middle group and they couldn't figure out who you were, but you had to have it for your ID. That was something else that happened. Your ID declared which racial group you were slotted into. They would do what was called the pencil test. And the pencil test was basically they would take a pencil and they would stick it in your hair. And, whoops, they would stick it in your hair. And if it stayed in when you bent over, then you were considered a black person. If it fell out, if it stayed in, when you bent over, you were considered a black person. If it fell out, you were white. So super scientific method, right? Where if you put the pencil in your hair and bend over, look, I'm not white anymore, right? Which is crazy because as previously noted, I'm a ghost that's a little bit less tan. But that was the pencil test. So there was no rules. There was no kind of regulation to this. It was just basic, straight up constructing people based off of a stereotype or an idea. So take a second and pause me, click on the link in this week's module that mentions apartheid, watch the informational video, and then come back. And when you come back, we'll talk a little bit more. Here is your happy pause face. Are you done? I hope you're done. Okay, good. Moving on. So ethnicity is a little different than race. Ethnicity is what we call a socially defined category based on a bunch of different things. Here's some examples: language, religion, nationality, history. Any sort of cultural factor puts you in the category of ethnicity. So while race is looking at biological, real or perceived biological differences, ethnicity is looking more at your culture. So the types of food you eat, the language you speak, the way you dress, all of that kind of falls into ethnicity. And when we're talking about ethnicity, symbolic ethnicity tends to be kind of a really easy way to think about how people break up based off of culture. So symbolic ethnicity is essentially when you are part of an ethnic identity, but you don't really subscribe to it except for special occasions. So, maybe once a year at Christmas, whatever your heritage is, you are extra that at Christmas, right? So like my mom is Italian, and Christmas time was extra Italian with pasta and bread and all sorts of Italian goodies, right? Because that one day out of the year, if we couldn't be Italian 365 days out of the year, we were going to do it one day out of the year and we were going to go hard, right? St. Patrick's Day is another really good example of ethnicity. You may or may not be Irish. You may not have any Irish in you. I, by the way, have like 5%, or maybe it was a little more like 10% Irish in me. The rest of my family is like Italian and German, and they have these beautiful olive complexions and this dark straight hair. And I got this, right? Nothing about me says Italian or German. Maybe my nose, I don't know. But the little bit of Irish landed in my head, right? Not in my head, on my head with my hair. With St. Patrick's Day, everybody suddenly is like, oh no, I'm like 5.2% Irish. Oh no, I'm like 0.0004% Irish on my dad's side, twice removed, right? This is symbolic ethnicity, something that's not significant the rest of the year, but on one day, everybody is a part of it. So when we're talking about race and ethnicity, there's a few terms. The first is we're going to switch to here. I'm going to make this little gesture so I know we're going to ignore that. Okay, so the way that the main sociological theories approach race and ethnicity, I'm going to kind of run through a few of them for you. The first is symbolic interaction. So symbolic interactions approach is that the way we label things is what creates a prejudice. So this is how we get things like racial slurs, because if we apply a label to a group of people, it becomes really easy really quickly to see that group of people as that label. So one example I have up in the corner here is sports teams and the way that we name sports teams. And there's a lot of conflict and controversy around calling people things like the Kansas City Chiefs, the Washington Redskins, which Redskin is like an incredibly offensive word in Native American communities. It's, some people say it's up there with the N-word for them. So to hear a team called that is just like a massive smack in their face. Symbolic interaction says that once we start labeling people as something, it becomes really easy to discriminate against them. So if we take one racial or ethnic group and we apply labels to them, like poor, stupid, dirty, we've kind of seen this happen with the word immigrant, right? This term that just means one who comes from another country. Immigrant has become its own sort of label that has a lot of fire and prejudice around it. If we start to label people as that, it becomes really easy to discriminate against them, because you can say to yourself, oh, well, all people of that group are stupid. All people of that group don't care. Those types of people, they don't want to work, right? It becomes really, really easy to justify in your mind the prejudice or discrimination you feel against them. Oh, I don't hire people of that race or ethnicity because they're sort of lazy and I don't want to work with lazy people. That's the kind of stuff that we hear in most everyday conversation. And this is coming from, and symbolic interaction tries to explain that this is coming from this notion that it's faster to discriminate against someone if you label them as something. And that's how symbolic interaction approaches race. Conflict theory, remember we're talking about power and power structures with conflict theory. So with conflict theory and race, we're concerned with how power can be used to divide people, specifically based off of race. So how we can place people into different racial groups and give a lot of power to a few of those groups, don't give much power to the rest of them, and then sort of watch and see what happens, right? This sort of is the formula for all oppression, right? Give power to a little bit of to a few groups, keep power away from some other groups, and then whoever is the dominant group in all of this can just sort of sit back and watch them fight each other, okay? This is the Sharks and the Jets, if those of you who know musical theater and West Side Story. Because if you can keep people fighting, if you can keep them in constant conflict, then you can go off and do whatever you want and nobody's going to pay any attention to you. If you can keep groups conflicted or fighting amongst themselves, then the dominant group gets away with everything. And this is how we have sort of come to this point of racial divide, where if a group that is dominant can keep other groups, some may say minority groups, fighting amongst each other or competing for resources, for jobs, for experience, for money, you name it. If we can do that, then those groups are going to fight amongst each other. Everyone else can go off and do their thing. No one's paying any attention to the group that is off being dominant. So when we're talking about conflict theory, I want you to think about how groups can be pitted against each other, specifically by people in power. So what has happened in American society, if you can think globally in international society, what kinds of stuff has happened that has kept groups fighting against each other based on race? And that would be conflict theory. That would be how conflict theory would look at racial ethnic division. Functionalism. So functionalism is going to look at how race, kind of taking a turn from conflict theory. Functionalism is going to look at how race gives people kind of a collective bond, a collective group. We've talked about what collective groups are and different types of groups in the lecture on groups. Functionalism is going to see how race can create a social tie, how it can create a group bond. And then I want to talk about assimilation. So assimilation is one of those terms that we talk about when we talk about race and ethnicity. We also talk about it when we talk about culture, because it's something that most people experience either at a really minor level all the way to major levels. And I'm going to give you kind of a major example in a second. But essentially, assimilation is when you take on the norms, the culture, the values, the expectations of a group that is not your own. So it's when you set aside your own culture, your own experiences, your own race, your own ethnicity, and you take on what is the dominant culture's perception of everything. It's basically giving away your identity and your culture in lieu of a new identity and a new culture. So here's my kind of extreme example. When I was in college, I worked at JCPenney. And this was before like everything was super automated. And it was actually kind of before 9/11. So there's a whole other aspect to it as far as security and all of that. But I worked there for a few years before and after 9/11. And I worked with a woman whose name was Judy. Now, Judy came from Vietnam to the United States when she thinks she was about 10. She's not sure. But putting it at that point in history, she was about 50 when I met her, which meant that she came to the US right about the time the Vietnam War was starting to really boil up and over for the United States. In Vietnam, it was a whole other story. It had been going on for quite some time. And she started her journey to the US on a raft. So not in a boat, not in a ship, not even in like a kayak. She she started on a raft, and the raft got her and her family to, I forget where, I forget which city, but it got her to a place where her family could then sort of get on a series of transportation, eventually flying to the United States. So when she came here, her parents said, okay, we are American now. We are no longer Vietnamese. We're not going to take on any more of Vietnamese culture. We are going to completely become American. So the parents changed their children's names and their own names. Judy's name wasn't Judy when she was in Vietnam. It was Thai, Thai Bon, Bon. So her and her siblings got all new names. They took birthdays that they thought were considered patriotic. So her birthday was Flag Day, which is in, I think, June. She thinks her real birthday was sometime in October, but she doesn't remember what the actual date was. And they were completely pushed away from anything Vietnamese that they did in school, that they did at home. When she was an adult, I went to her home because she cooked for me. The one thing she did keep was her food. She kept her food tradition alive and cooked the stuff that her mother cooked for her. So I went to her house and met her family because I was a poor college student, and she took advantage. She took me in and fed me and did all sorts of things that were nice for me. And she cooked for me. That was the only thing she kept. But if you would go into her home, you would see just a real basic cookie cutter, like white suburban, white as in like the walls were white, suburban home, really kind of bare. The only thing I noticed that showed Vietnamese culture at all was she had a little table set up in a corner with a candle and a picture of her father that she tried to keep burning all day as a tribute to him. But other than that, nothing. This is assimilation, right? This is a person that took all of her culture and said, her family said, we're not doing that anymore. We are now American. We're going to be as American as we can possibly be. She made sure her children played football and did cheerleading because in her mind, it doesn't get much more American than that. She was really funny. She would steal my name tag and wear it around JCPenney and then leave hers for me in my drawer where my name tag normally would be. And I would call her up and be like, why did you steal my name tag? And she would say, because I want people to think I'm you. And at the time I was like 20, and I go, do I look like a 50-year-old Vietnamese woman? And she'd be like, yes, you do. She was really funny. But this is assimilation. This is what we do when we give up our own culture in lieu of somebody else's. All right, last example is institutional racism. So institutional racism in the past few years has become a little bit more relevant, a little bit more in our face. I don't know that the term has become as dominant, but it is definitely something we've become more aware of, mostly because of Black Lives Matter, also because of the current presidential administration that we have and the laws and policies that have been enacted. Essentially, institutional racism is patterns of discrimination that are built into our social institutions. So if you need examples of social institutions, we're talking about things like colleges and universities, hospitals, healthcare, family life, pretty much anything that keeps a society functioning can be considered an institution. Criminal justice, our government. I have the example of housing on here. Basically, institutional racism is stuff that has worked its way into those systems, into those social institutions, is racism that has become part of them and is so permeated so far deep in them that we don't even know it's there. It's just become common for us. It's just become common knowledge. And usually it means that a group has been targeted based on race. Most of the time, it has become so permeated that it's completely unnoticed or overlooked. So there's a couple examples of this. One I'm going to link to on Canvas for you to read through after we're done with lecture. But one common way that this has been addressed is through people sending out resumes. So in 2003, there was a study done where a group at Harvard took, I think it was 100 resumes. I might be wrong on the number, but 50 of them had names that sounded white. 50 of them had names that sounded African American or Black. They sent everything else on the resume was exactly the same. Education, experience, everything was exactly the same. The only thing that was different was the name. And they sent them out. And what they found was that within 3 weeks, people who had resumes that had white sounding names got calls back. Within 3 months, people who had Black or African American sounding names got calls back. So that's a big chunk of difference, especially if you're waiting for a job between 3 weeks and 3 months. This is institutional racism. Just the fact that somebody's name sounds a little bit less white means that some companies may say, you know what, I don't know that I like this person, or there's something about this resume I don't like. They may not be blatantly saying, hey, this name sounds like somebody I don't want to hire. They may just have something in their mind that's a little red flag. But it does show that this is something that has woven its way into our system that we may not even realize it's there anymore. Hiring practices is a big part of this. The criminal justice system, which you'll get into as we watch 13th, which is one of your assignments, is to watch the film 13th. Criminal justice system is another one where you have series of judges and attorneys and prosecutors who kind of zone in on people of color just based off of some sort of prejudice or stereotype that they have. And that's why we end up with one of the reasons why we end up with more people of color locked up and behind bars. So this is institutional racism. So I hope you enjoyed lecture. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye.